Why didn't I think of that? The world is full of examples of instances when this lament strikes us, whether it's a piece of corrugated cardboard to wrap around a paper coffee cup, or a plain stone called a pet rock, or the insight that informs a scholar that the earth is truly not the center of the universe, or the intuition that causes a great general to violate every textbook prescription and attack at the proper moment when the enemy least expects. It may be counterintuitive. It may go against what everyone else knows is conventional wisdom. This flash of insight operates in the business world, in the military, in sports, in science, and in politics. It is what separates the merely good strategists from the great. It's rare, and yet it's prevalent enough to have garnered a name. Perhaps showing his admiration for Napoleon, Karl von Clausewitz called this quality of strategic insight coup d'oeil. This is a French phrase that means stroke of the eye. Coup d'oeil is the flash of insight that propels us to launch a strategic idea. This coup d'oeil goes by other names as well: intuition, instinct, sixth sense. Whether this strategic glance can be cultivated or trained over time is a question that has been debated for centuries. Is it a form of genius, or is it a skill that can be learned? Traditionally, this notion of the flash of insight at the proper time and place has been thought mysterious, even a form of extrasensory perception, and perhaps unfathomable. But this idea that intuition is inaccessible has undergone a radical reassessment in recent years. We used to think of analysis and intuition as two distinctly different processes, but now scientists believe that there is a single mode of thought that combines analysis and intuition. Scientists call this new model intelligent memory, and it operates as creative insight, in which the brain assembles existing pieces of information and combines them in novel ways. This, of course, is the very essence of business strategy as defined by Harvard business professor Michael Porter. And in science, Thomas Kuhn, the great philosopher of science, contended that the scientific method starts with a profound respect for past achievements that the scientist then combines in a flash of insight. We have these commonalities across disciplines. In chess, it is the quality shared by all great masters, the flash of insight that leads to beautiful and elegant combinations for victory, patterns of interaction that elude the majority of us, but once shown to us, we see them so clearly. What's new and what concerns us here and now is the idea of intuition as a quality that can be cultivated. Can strategic insight be cultivated? Can we develop coup d'oeil? Perhaps we can. The latest research suggests just that. Under certain conditions, we can cultivate our own abilities to achieve insight in certain circumstances. We can certainly evaluate the circumstances that lead to the flash of insight. And then we can strive to create those conditions ourselves. Let's first look at how the experts tell us to make decisions. Second, we look at several examples of coup d'oeil in action. Third, we review what the latest research says. And finally, we learn some easy steps to cultivate our propensity to receive that blinding insight at the moment we need it most. We have several models of decision-making that have been developed by bright minds with the best of intentions. Decision-making models can be illustrated with flowcharts, decision points, and arrows, giving the process a kind of scientific precision. We all like to think of ourselves as smart, rational people, and the idea of our thinking process as being scientific, well, that's good for the ego. The process usually goes something like this. We analyze the problem. We list our different options. We evaluate all of our options against common criteria and weight the criteria as to importance. We add it all up. Voila! The decision is made for us. Well, for lots of folks, this is desirable. As one academic has said, well, who wouldn't want to be thorough, systematic, rational, and scientific? This four-step process, or one much like it, it permeates decision-making in business. But this model of decision-making is more honored in the breach than in the observance. Procedures can take on a life of their own, and they persist even when experience shows them to be lacking. Strategic theorist William Duggan teaches at Columbia University's Business School, and he advises the U.S. military on decision-making theory. He points out the gap. Quote, "Decision makers only use this four-step method if they have to, if official procedures make them do it. When left to their own devices, they use strategic intuition, and the more complex or the more unfamiliar a situation, the more they must do so. Yet there seems to be something sacred in the world of planning about this four-step method, and about the second step especially, generate multiple solutions." Here again, some of our finest analysis comes from the military, which first recognized the importance of strategic intuition and gave it equal prominence with analytical decision-making. It divided decision-making into two separate modes, and it cited two different situations where the two types of thought are appropriate. First, the analytical approach. This approach serves well when time is available to analyze all facets affecting the problem and its solution. However, analytical decision-making consumes time, and it doesn't work well in all situations, especially during execution when circumstances often require immediate decisions. Second, intuitive decision-making. This is appropriate when we don't have time. It speeds up decision-making. Intuitive decision-making doesn't work well when the situation includes inexperienced leaders, complex or unfamiliar situations, or competing courses of action. Until the 21st century, this was the official military view, these two separate processes. But the latest research shows us a quite different reality. As Gary Klein shows us, expert decision makers do not generate multiple options and then pick one. They do something very different. Expert decision makers study a situation, step A, and the problem and solution come to them at the same time, step B. They think through the implications to arrive at a course of action, step C, and then they commit to it or they reject it if they think it will not work, step D. This type of decision-making has been ridiculed by many folks enamored of the more scientific model, calling it flying by the seat of one's pants. But in an earlier century, it was the subject of a more elegant phrase, the stroke of the eye, coup d'oeil. Karl von Clausewitz was ahead of his time in many ways with much of his thought on conflict between nations. His thoughts on what he called military genius appear as fresh today as when he first penned them more than 170 years ago. Clausewitz, he tried to explain exactly how the greatest military commanders made their most brilliant decisions during the hottest of battles, where nothing is certain. "Conflict is the realm of chance," said Clausewitz. "No other human activity gives it greater scope. No other has such incessant and varied dealings with this intruder. Chance makes everything uncertain and interferes with the whole course of events." So, rising to the challenge is the quality of military genius, which consists of two equal parts. Quote, "An intellect that even in the darkest hour retains some glimmerings of the inner light which leads to truth. And second, the courage to follow this faint light wherever it may lead." Coup d'oeil is a French word, and it may create an unnecessary halo effect over the quality itself. So let's talk about strategic intuition in more straightforward terms so that we can better come to grips with it. According to William Duggan, strategic intuition consists in the, quote, "selective projection of past elements into the future in a new combination as a course of action that might or might not fit your previous goals, with the personal commitment to follow through and work out the details along the way." It's no coincidence that this definition fits very closely with Porter's definition of strategy as doing things differently, the assembly of resources in new and imaginative ways to achieve a competitive advantage. We have so many advanced methods of analysis and decision-making today that we sometimes forget that they're aids to problem solving. They're not the problem solvers themselves. Human beings are the problem solvers. Let's consider the principles of strategy for a moment as the equivalent of acquiring what we call in business best practices. If everyone observes best practices, then the efficiency frontier is pushed out and no one achieves sustained competitive advantage. Everyone achieves competitive parity in the longer run as knowledge is diffused. We can even call it a form of arbitrage. But in the short run, even temporary competitive advantage can be a powerful tonic. It can be enough to win a battle or two or three. In war, in business, in politics and sports, it can sometimes be enough. So the question remains, how do you obtain even fleeting competitive advantage when everyone has read the book of strategy? If, for instance, every general practices the art of war as drawn from a well-known body of strategic theory, then on what axle does the wheel of victory turn? Does the outcome then become a simple mathematical calculation? It becomes a matter to which leaders apply strategic intuition. So what happens when both sides of a conflict are both steeped in the military strategy of the time, when officers from both sides are schooled in the latest theory and opposing each other on the field of battle, applying those theories against each other? Do we have such a case? As a matter of fact, we do. The American Civil War. The Civil War is a superb example of a case that comes close to being a controlled experiment to test our notion of strategic intuition versus strategy as a checklist. Few times in history will two sides in a conflict be staffed with officers schooled as classmates at the same military academy, taught the same theories by the same instructors, and having served with each other in a previous major conflict, and with the battles fought over ground increasingly familiar to both sides. The Civil War offers a 4-year skein of battles, great and small, in which the theories of strategy of the day were tested and tested again. In such a conflict, we might expect that with so many things being equal, that objective factors would win the day. We might be able to simply tote up the objective factor endowments of each side and predetermine a victor. In the Civil War, for instance, the North was possessed of overwhelming superiority in almost every category that we use to measure military power. It was a conflict between a modern industrial society versus an agrarian economy. The North possessed tremendous advantages in population, in territory, armories, industrial production, naval power, railroad mileage. In such a conflict, a reasonable person might conclude that the outcome should not be in doubt. Moreover, such a conflict ought to end quickly. Most observers at the time thought it would end quickly in the North's favor. But it did not end quickly. It lasted 4 years, and it took more than 600,000 lives. For much of the conflict, its outcome was in doubt. In fact, at times a Southern victory appeared within reach. We can look to strategy and strategic thinking to explain this counterintuitive result. We look specifically to the factor of strategic insight, or coup d'oeil, to explain the unexplainable. This insight has both tactical and strategic applications. It is the insight of when, at the crucial moment in a battle, to strike at a particular position, or to fall back to a new position. Such insight has a strategic element in planning and instinctual foresight granted by experience, and some say by providence. It offers a lightning strike of insight when to diverge from strategic doctrine as commonly practiced, of when to break the rules in ways unimagined by lesser leaders, those animated by the rules. Napoleon, perhaps the embodiment of everything we imagine when we envision coup d'oeil, observed, quote, "The art of war consists with an inferior army of always having more forces than your enemy at the point where you attack, or at the point which is attacked. But this art cannot be learned either from books or from practice. It's a feeling of command which properly constitutes the genius for war." Let's look at our example from the Civil War, the Battle of Chancellorsville. The time was May of 1863. The South was in the ascendance following a string of victories in the Eastern Theater by the Army of Northern Virginia over the Union Army of the Potomac. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is considered by some historians to be the greatest fighting force of the 19th century. Cohesive, well-trained, well-led, loyal, and motivated by chivalric values. This Confederate States Army was confronted by a Northern Army twice its size near Chancellorsville. This is in Virginia, under the command of Union Major General Joseph Hooker. Again, we are presented with the conundrum of objective factors versus strategy versus high concept, strategic insight. Think of it, Lee versus Hooker. Both of them schooled at West Point Military Academy. Both served in the Mexican-American War of the late 1840s, and they fought together at the Battle of Chapultepec in the Mexican-American War in 1847. The Virginia terrain was familiar to both men. They both learned at the figurative feet of the Swiss-born French strategist Antoine Jomini, whose principles were taught in West Point classrooms. Hooker, he commanded the superior force. He was entrenched on superb terrain, better supplied, greater numerically by 2 to 1, 133,000 Union soldiers versus only 60,000 Southern troops. Now, in this situation, surely the superior force would easily defeat the inferior opponent using Jominian principles of planning and maneuver. And yet, in the most lopsided contest of the entire Civil War, Lee won. It's been called his perfect battle. Lee violated one of the most bedrock pieces of conventional wisdom: never divide your army in the face of a superior foe. Yet this is exactly what Lee did. Hooker played by the book, and Lee broke the rules. It was the human qualities of intuitive audacity versus analytic timidity. What happened? Hooker had concentrated his army in a formidable position, which he had carefully and skillfully fortified. Lee went into bivouac to confer with his top Lieutenant General, Stonewall Jackson. During the night, Lee's engineers reconnoitered the Federal front, and they pronounced a direct attack impracticable. Something in the lay of the land, the descriptions of his engineers, something in his experience told Lee what to do. And it was then that Lee said to Jackson, "We must attack from our left," and Jackson was prepared. According to Lee's own account, he, quote, stated to General Jackson, "We must attack on our left as soon as practicable," and the necessary movement of the troops began immediately. While Jackson moved surreptitiously in a forced march around the Union flank, Lee confronted and attempted to hold in place the great mass of Hooker's army with just 2 divisions of troops, just 13,000 men against 70,000 men. The dense forest on the front prevented Hooker from detecting the small Confederate numbers. For their part, on the other side, the Confederates made fierce feint attacks with infantry and artillery against Hooker's front. They kept up almost continuous fire. And this deceived Hooker, made him hesitate to advance from his entrenchments to find out the actual situation. And in this way, Lee held him all day in check, while Jackson swiftly marched around the Union right flank. Jackson attacked at 5 p.m. after a forced march, and he caught the Federals completely by surprise. They were cooking their dinner when Jackson's troops charged the Union camp and swept everything before them. It was only the approaching darkness that halted the Confederate attack and prevented a complete rout of the entire Army of the Potomac. The decision to split his army in the face of 2 to 1 odds may have seemed like madness to junior officers or even veterans. It was something that Hooker did not expect. It was a decision born of necessity. It was no strategic checklist that led Lee to make his decision. It was strategic insight. Lee's intuition, his knowledge of the terrain, his knowledge of Hooker's timidity, his faith in the indomitable Stonewall Jackson, in his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, all of this came together in the mind of Lee in some unknown calculus. The result was a decision to go against what he and Hooker had learned in school at West Point from Jomini. 70 years later, another general from another country recognized what Lee accomplished at Chancellorsville and what it meant for generals in all places and in all times. German General Waldemar Erfurth penned a classic on warfare called Surprise. In it, he urged a balance between the mundane checklist view of strategy and an over-reliance upon instinct. But above all, he urged the daring necessary to strike when an opponent has left himself vulnerable. Quote, "The military leader must indeed be able to rid himself from traditional precepts, yet in doing so, he should never forget that heterodoxy has its limits beyond which it is no longer effective, but becomes dangerous. Above all, the soldier must learn to recognize the mistakes of the enemy and to exploit them, though this may sometimes require departure from accepted military rules." In our own time, folks who study intuition recognize that there is much more to strategic intuition than magic, or a hunch, or instinct. Gary Klein has become one of this country's foremost experts on intuitive decision-making. Gary studies firefighters to see how they make their fast decisions under extreme time pressure and stress. Now, he already knew that in the literal heat of a fire, an experienced firefighter, he doesn't make decisions according to the standard analytical model, comparing the many ways to, say, put out a fire. No, Gary thought that they'd come up with maybe two options and then act. But he was wrong. Most firefighters, especially ones with more experience, usually just considered a single option. They would just act. The most common statement he heard from firefighters was, quote, "We don't make decisions." Now, these firefighters would simply respond to the situation. Gary was amazed. Quote, "I had stumbled onto the phenomenon of intuition, although I didn't realize it at the time, although I wasn't looking for intuition. Intuition had found me." It turns out that these firefighters and nurses and doctors and military officers, early responders of all types, share a common skill: intuitive decision-making. In business, the idea of intuition in decision-making it's not all that readily accepted. It still carries the whiff of magical incantation. But in the military, for instance, the United States Marine Corps, intuitive decision-making is part of the training process. The term intuitive decision-making appears in their manual on command and control, and it's compared favorably with analytical decision-making. In this case, Gary Klein views intuition as the gradual amalgamation of large repertoires of patterns that are acquired over many years of practice, actions and responses that train the mind to understand a multitude of experiences and then quickly yield the correct answer in similar situations in the future. Without these patterns, without this experience base, decision makers would be paralyzed. Formal analyses can be valuable to supplement intuition, but they cannot substitute for intuition when it comes to business decisions or career decisions or political decisions. Gary Klein has successfully moved our perception of intuition to a reasonable recognition of its value. Two extreme views predominated: the realm of the magical, where intuition was inexplicable, and the realm of the skeptical, where intuition was ridiculed. He suggests that we combine the approaches of intuition and analysis. Let's build on the strengths of each, recognizing their weaknesses as well. A good synthesis of the two that seems most effective is when we allow intuition to lead the way so that it directs our analysis. And in this way, intuition helps us recognize situations and helps us decide our actions. Analysis then verifies our intuitions to make sure they aren't misleading us. In this way, we can come up with a method of cultivating our own intuition and of relying upon it, learning to trust it under the right circumstances. Here is a 7-step general guide to help you begin developing and utilizing your intuitive insights as you tackle problems. 1. Recognize that the first option you think of is probably the best. This is not always true, but it tends to be correct, and it is substantiated by research. So recognize your first impulse before you erode it with too much analysis. Record it. Hold it for consideration. Analyze it as part of your decision-making process. Evaluate your first impulse in the context of your experience by imagining how your decision would be carried out and what could go wrong. Do your own personal scenario planning. 2. Ensure that you understand what's going on here. You can deliberate all day, but if you don't understand what is going on, your choice of action will likely be wrong. 3. override your intuitions when they mislead you. It's dangerous to use intuition without reflection because it can lead to fixation. We may think we understand a situation even if we don't, and then we make matters worse by catering to our bias and explaining away all contrary evidence. To break free of inaccurate beliefs, ask yourself if there is any evidence that would make you change your mind. If not, then you've built a cocoon around your beliefs. 4, think ahead. Intuition can help us think ahead of the curve by creating expectations, by connecting the dots, by flagging inconsistencies, or by warning us of problems. The world is too complex to think ahead using careful analysis of situations. We have to rely on our intuition instead. But to rely on it, we have to give intuition a chance. 5, uncertainty is a natural component of intuitive decision-making. Too many people become frustrated, even fearful with uncertainty. Uncertainty can paralyze them or send them chasing for information that will arrive too late and still won't be enough to answer all the questions. You never have perfect information to make a certain decision until you've been overcome by events. The key is knowing when there's enough information to act and then having the courage to act. Here it's helpful to remember Clausewitz's recipe for military genius. Quote, an intellect that, even in the darkest hour, retains some glimmerings of the inner light which leads to truth. And second, the courage to follow this faint light wherever it may lead. 6, use the right decision-making strategy. You can rely on intuition, sure, but at times it's best to evaluate all of the factors that impinge on your decision. If the issues are complicated and no one has good intuitions about the overall situation, analysis makes more sense than relying on gut feelings. 7, watch out for the naysayers. Here are the signs of those naysayers. Management doesn't value the experience of key employees. Superiors expect employees to follow directions without being given the chance to have them clarified. Management is intolerant of uncertainty and relies on massive amounts of data collection as a cure for uncertainty. Systems encourage everyone to manage by using simple numerical goals to make things clear. Management starts looking for ways to substitute computer systems for human expertise. Now, there is, of course, a lot more than these 7 tips, but they're a start, and they can get you on your way to becoming a more intuitive thinker, a more effective strategic thinker. Through all of this, let's remember the good news. Brilliant insights are not necessarily the stuff of genius, and creativity is no longer a mysterious force. The ability to assemble and reassemble data in new and innovative ways is not limited to the Napoleons or the Steve Jobs of the world. It's accessible to you and to me, and it can be developed. With the right approach and right techniques, creative insight can be cultivated.